Eswael, Alicia Telsqui, Talisoqua Yakakuyus. Good morning, everyone. My traditional name is Alicia. My home is Yakakuyus, a small Coast Salish reserve in the Fraser Valley in Chilliwack, BC. We consist of one family, 81 members on 49 acres. We are part of the Stalo Nation with 24 communities from Langley to Yale. We are 70 miles east of Vancouver. And I am the second oldest on our reserve, and that alone is scary. How did time pass so fast? I'm 69. I am the oldest of eight, four sisters and three brothers. In our culture, elders ask where you come from. I am now an orphan. My late dad, Siamchis Frank Malloway, from Yakakuyus. My late mother, Quitasulot Mary Malloway. She was a Julian from Matsqui Reservation. My paternal grandparents, the Latchil Richard Malloway and Edna McIntyre Malloway from Lytton First Nation. My maternal grandparents are Martin Julian from Matsqui, Flora Joe Julian, married to my grandfather in Matsqui, is from Chiacton First Nation. I have three children, two sons and one daughter. My husband of 25 years, Thomas George from Halalt First Nation on Vancouver Island. He has two sons and two daughters. So together with their mates, we have a blended family of 12 children, 15 grandchildren, and 5 greats with 3 on the way. The great grandchildren are from my kiddos. Our nation is hereditary system. My late dad passed on his hereditary chieftainship to me in 2016. I am the first female hereditary chief in our family. I am not the first female hereditary chief in BC. Just a little bit of history. I'm second generation residential school survivor with my mother attending St. Mary's Residential School in Mission, BC, and she vowed to keep us out of residential school. Another history is, like they always say, we don't, everything is that we need to forget. But I am third generation of the potlatch band. My grandfather, Richard Malloway, had a gathering in the woods, underground. He was raided by the RCMP. I don't know what it was in that time, but they demanded to know who hosted the gathering. A young man, knowing that my grandfather had a family and a dairy farm to look after, came forward and said it was his. He was jailed for months. I'm sorry that I had to read everything. I had to write everything down because I get so tongue-tied. I get so scared when I have to speak. And then so after I'm done, then I'll say, oh, I forgot to say this and I forgot to say that. So I got it all written down so I wouldn't forget. So I'm welcoming you to our nations in here in the Fraser Valley, and I'm thankful that and honored, humbled to be asked to do a welcome.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. It's just really important, especially with this particular session, for us to take the time. So thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. Today's focus, as Janet said, was really focusing in on strengthening Indigenous employment outcomes in the rural community. And this was a part of the focus of the research that we did. And what we wanted to do was kind of take some time today to focus in on what that means. So we are going to have some roundtable discussions here today. In our previous sessions, we've had some more panel presentations. Our very first session was focused more on really reviewing what the research said. But we're going to have a bit more of a flatter discussion here where we're going to have some back and forth between groups. And we also want to have some ability for participants to share their thoughts. So there's going to be some space for that as well. And then we'll wrap up with just a brief Q&A. And as always, we'll be putting in some opportunities for some breakout groups. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Peter. Megan and Peter are going to discuss a little bit more about how we tried to really contextualize our research for Indigenous populations. So as I mentioned, that was one of the focus of the groups that we were looking at. We were also looking at people who maybe had disabling conditions, whether that be physical or, neurotypical ways of thinking, or queer communities as well. But we really tried to hone in on that Indigenous focus. So I'll turn it over to both of them to give a little bit more context there.
Thanks so much, Cassie. A great introduction. I appreciate that. Um, when we started to look at this work, we had recognized that there was this kind of disconnect occurring in our community, and we assumed that it was probably occurring in other communities of a similar size and nature. And so we thought we would examine this. And what was really important to us was to approach this work in a decolonized approach, that it had to be based in relationships and connections. It had to be about really talking to people in their place. And I think too, as an organization, it was important to us to bring together folk who were not typically involved in research. And so we were very fortunate to be able to access a project coordinator and some folk who had lived experience, and those people were able to conduct work in a very profound way. Um, and yeah, I think the success of the project largely exists between the partnerships that we had, but also the way in which we conducted that work. I'd like to bring in Megan because she is the project coordinator, and she can go into much more detail about the way in which we overcame those colonial structures and systems through our methodology.
So, it we took a very slow approach really to our onboarding process, and the hiring process was very intentional. As Peter said, we prioritized hiring those with lived experience, shared lived experience, to those of our research participants. I am someone who lives with a disability, an invisible disability. And we did hire a research assistant with a visible disability, as well as Emily, who is Indigenous and was able to bring in some of that local Indigenous perspective as well. And in addition to that, we had a sister project on the go called Diversity at Work, which I will drop the link for that in the chat soon. But that was also co-run by another Indigenous colleague of ours, Mallory, as well. And so our team worked very closely together and supported each other, and had those very difficult conversations when it came to how we move through this work in a decolonized way and with inclusion and recognition of the history of colonization at the forefront of our minds at all times. So in the onboarding process, we had a 3-week comprehensive orientation that took those 3 weeks before we even began to talk about the research itself. In them, the research assistants completed the Indigenous Canada course that is provided through Coursera online in partnership with the University of Calgary. We accessed resources from Indigenous-led organizations such as Indigenous Corporate Training, Inc. They have some really incredible free resources as well as paid resources to support in particularly onboarding non-Indigenous employees in regards to learning some of the background and some of the language around indigeneity and the history of colonization here in Canada. And we spent a lot of time talking about truth and reconciliation, as well as the 94 calls to action and what our role may be in supporting those calls to action and in truth and reconciliation within the work. the research assistants prioritized forming relationships within the local Indigenous communities early on in the research process, and that included a lot of time on the ground, knocking on the doors of band offices, providing them with as much information as possible, and answering any questions they may have. And it really was an organic and slow going process, we could say, as we did approach it with curiosity and uncertainty, and really did take time throughout every step of the process to reflect and look at how we may have been able to move forward either in a different way or a better way, or what worked really, really well.
Yeah, I want to emphasize how much the research assistants really did shape the project. It wasn't just bringing people on to play a small role or just to do the implementation, right? They were part of the process of figuring out language and approach. And when it came to pulling together the results and analyzing the data, forming the recommendations, like they had a voice there as well. And so I think that's really important when we're looking at inclusion. It needs to be meaningful inclusion as well. And I think Megan did a really great job helping us walk that path and also have those hard conversations around language and approach and slowing things down sometimes. And so I think that was really, really important as well. Peter, any thoughts on that as well? Or shall we move on to talk to our invited guests?
No, I just really want to support the piece that Megan said about time. I think that so often within our field and our work, we're working within a very structured amount of time. And we were very fortunate to have the flexibility to take our time and to really talk through pieces, to sit with pieces, and to revisit our approach, our methodology, our language. I think, having had the advisory committee was such a useful part of this because we had experienced things or, discussed things, and then we brought it to that advisory group, and they were able to add or question or just really challenge us in some ways about how we had perceived something. And I think that was so useful. But again, it comes back to taking the time to do it. So yeah, thanks for that, Megan.
And I think that time really helped because you could see the momentum build at the end where we got an unexpected, focus groups were very difficult for us to organize because of the time for people, like for employers to take time off and to be on site, like physically in those spaces. And near the end of the project, we were able to get an Indigenous specific focus group pulled together of students. And that was just a really wonderful opportunity to take a deeper look. And if we didn't have the flexibility in our methodology, we wouldn't have been able to do that. And so I think that was really important to recognize that dynamic space.
We're very fortunate to have some of the people from our advisory group here on this call today. So thanks for being here with us.
Awesome. Okay, Peter, well, let's move forward with our guests.
Well, it gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce Diana. Diana describes herself as a Métis woman and a single mother of 5 children. Holy moly. She recently graduated from Seabird Island College. And when you think about that, she has 5 children, single mom, and just graduated from college, which is amazing, as a community support and mental health worker. And she tells us that she enjoys being with and around people and supporting those who want support. So welcome, Diana. Thanks for joining us. Now, Diana also got to do something else that was pretty cool. We developed a podcast at the end of our work to kind of convert our findings into language, really. And so what we were able to do there was bring together some actors, and Diana got to be one of our actors. And so she got to express the words of many of the people, certainly the Indigenous people who we had spoken to. And so, what I'm interested in, Diana, is when you were playing that role, when you were fulfilling that function, what really resonated with you when you were reading those words and getting to speak those words?
Um, it was interesting. Um, I I didn't realize how much there was for Indigenous people, to be honest. It seemed like, because I don't know much about my culture, unfortunately, just learning how other people had to survive, and just, yeah, I enjoyed it very much, just learning everything that I did. Um, Within reading that podcast, it was amazing to learn so much from it.
Wonderful. You've shared with us about your own life experience, and I'm just wondering, how has the progression of your identity occurred in your life through your various experiences in education and some of the things that you've shared with us?
Um, s- I don't know how to put it now. Um, I have, I didn't learn about being Métis until I was, I think, like in my 20s, my teen years even. Um, Being in school, I was called every name in the book because I had different skin color. Um, Going to Seaward Island was amazing. I enjoyed being there because people welcomed me with open arms. They had a heart full of gold, basically, and they were very resourceful. Whereas being in the schools that I was in, of course, it was all white people, unfortunately, and they didn't understand the culture of Indigenous persons at all. So it was very difficult at that time, and I can understand now or I guess I don't really understand fully, but I understand a little bit of how it was for those who were in the 60s scoop, those who were in residential schools. I never lived that, so I don't know how it was, but I can kind of understand, being torn apart from your families, basically.
How do you think those kinds of experiences for people affected the way in which they could gain and maintain employment?
Um, More people understanding, more people knowing more about the Indigenous culture. I think that would make it a little easier for Indigenous people to be able to get employment better. Um, yeah, just knowing, having the knowledge.
You told us a bit about your kids' experience in school. How would you say it differs from your experience in school?
Um, I've always taught my kids to basically see people as they are, not by the color of their skin. Um, I have all my kids, except for two of them, look very Indigenous. The other three look white, but they have some of the Indigenous features, especially in their face. Um, when they were going to school, they were kind of picked on as well. Um, but now that there is a little bit more knowledge of the Indigenous culture, it's it wasn't as bad as how it was for me in school.
I guess that's progress.
Yes, I would say so.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for sharing.
No problem.
And
Thank you.
I think too, we're so appreciative of the work you did on the podcast. You brought a really great voice to that. And if you want to check out the podcast, I'm sure it's in one of those links that's been shared. So we're also very fortunate to have with us today Corinne Jenner. Um, Corinne and I served together on the Aspect board, and she has decided to stay on there. I'm now long in the tooth and retired. But Corinne brings her experience of working in the field, and she works with the Okanagan Training and Development Council, serving Indigenous people in the Thompson, Okanagan, Kootenay region. I hope I got that all right, Corinne. You've had an opportunity to read through the research and see what we've done. What would you say has really resonated with you as a field worker working with Indigenous clients in community?
So for me, I guess what's important to me is the more we share and the more we tell the stories and share the resources and research that's been done, I think it's going to make it better for First Nations people finding employment. I've worked within this sector for many, many years, starting within the early 80s. And so I've seen a lot of struggles and of Indigenous people trying to make their way within and trying to get employers to recognize and to hire and to be willing to train. It's difficult at times for First Nations people to enter, into the workforce.
We talked a bit about the disconnect between non-Indigenous employers and Indigenous people who are experiencing cultural needs. We talked a bit about, the loss of a member of the community and how that might impact people.
Mm-hmm.
Do you still see that kind of disconnect in employment?
Yes, I do. And I think again, these kinds of things need to be communicated. The employers don't always know, non-Indigenous employers don't know the history. They don't know the protocols that might happen. So for example, in our community, if it's a family member that passes, then the family is expected to be there and to be part of it. And that can be right from, getting things ready for the funeral, cooking the food to be prepped, watching the fire that has to burn. There's many, many protocols that need to happen. And employers, and I've even heard employers say, well, that's not our policy and you don't get time off for that. Because the way the non-Indigenous community looks at it is you have so many days that you're allowed, if it's a mom or dad, brother, sister, then you're allowed, I believe it's like 5 days to grieve. Then you got to get back to work. In the First Nations community, it's a little different than that. And I think in a lot of cases, it's communicating. It's just communicating what is the protocol, where do you stand in all of that. And it sort of needs to be communicated between employer and employee on how does the family expect this to happen, and what is the employer, what is their take on what is expected to happen. And I know in some cases, for me, you sort of have to look at both sides, because you could be maybe the only one there. And if you're gone, there might not be anyone to replace you. So in that case, if the Indigenous person just leaves their place of employment and doesn't come back, well, the employer thinks you've abandoned your job and you're gone. And so that's that. And they hire somebody else. So I think, again, it's communicating with employers on what is your stance within that community, and what is the protocols, and how can Indigenous people work together within that. It's out of respect for the families. And I just think the employers just don't understand the history of it all. So how do we work with that? It's a question that has to be put to the employers as well as to the employee. What is expected from the employer and what is expected on your side. And I think open communication is more key in that kind of area.
we've heard of employers who really embrace this kind of idea,
Yeah,
even to the point where they recognize that it might be a particular season, a gathering season or a hunting season, and so they're able to provide time off to their employee to go and,
right.
participate in those traditional practices.
Yes, and some employers are willing to understand that and to allow that time. And again, I think it comes along with that communication that when you're hired, explaining what is your role in the community. I work more in the urban area, so within with individuals that are in the urban area, they sort of come from different communities. They may not be from this community, they may be from a different community, but same thing, they may be called home because of someone passing, or they could be called home because this is hunting season and they're expected to be home and hunt for the families and the communities. So again, it's kind of different with people who live in community, and it can be a little different for people in the urban area. And again, I've had employers that are quite open to allowing, as long as they understand the when and the how and the why, they're quite open to that. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think most employers will embrace it if they understand it. So I think it's got to be open communication on both sides of what are you expected and willing to do, and what is the employer expected and willing to do, and understand that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's been really great speaking with you. And I'm going to turn it back to Cassie now. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Well, we had blocked out some time to talk about this building community and connections, but I heard a lot of that in the responses that both Corrine and Diana shared with us. Diana shared, really coming home into the space of her community, and then just talking about those differences in terms of what employers need to recognize about community needs of Indigenous folks. I've had some people share in the anonymous chat that is available in the Menti a few different comments. And so maybe we can just take one bit before we move on to the next topic. Someone had asked about learning how to get beyond racial bias in small communities is a challenge, but necessary for building bridges. And I thought maybe if either Diana or Corrine had some thoughts on that, before we move on, that would be wonderful.
Sorry, I missed that. Can you just repeat that again?
Of course. So the comment was around learning how to get beyond racial bias in small communities in order to sort of build those bridges forward.
Mm-hmm. So I guess again, for me, it's understanding the history of the First Nations people and the communities, because every community is different in what their protocols may be. And I think that again, communicating to employers. I mean, I come like I really respected Diane and what she had stated about being called all kinds of names growing up, and I went through the same thing. I was in a one-room schoolhouse. I was told I would never amount to nothing. And so I guess growing up for me, it was about if I can do it, anyone can do it. So I went on through life. I got my education and I carried on. Even though I never did graduate, I did go back and get educated a little more. But in my community, again, there's protocols that are expected. I mean, even from my family, when there was someone who passed, you were expected to attend and be there. And so employers just need to understand more of the history. And I think the more we talk about it, and I mean, I see First Nations people now. We see them in nursing, in lawyers. We see them. They're getting educated, and I think that's key. I think education is really important. And so if we can educate our people, I think then along with that comes the education of the employers. And again, just communicating openly to what is expected of each parties.
So as I mentioned before about having more knowledge, employers should have more knowledge. There should be like, I don't know, maybe a 2-day or 3-day course or something where employers should be able to take to understand more of the First Nations culture. I know I've had some trouble trying to find employment myself with myself being Indigenous. I know a lot of companies are now putting in their description of a job, people that are First Nations or Indigenous, they will, be on the top of the list kind of thing. I don't know how many places I've applied to and stated that I'm Métis, and I either don't get a call back or I get not selected by employer because of the fact that they they don't understand me. They don't understand the culture that I am. They don't understand how, like, they know the, I guess, the history of most Indigenous people, how they sold everything and they had alcohol. So most Indigenous people are alcoholics. So I think a lot of employers are kind of struggle with that because they don't want to have an employee that's coming in drunk or high on drugs all the time. I've known a couple people that have come into work a little over the top. um, and it's just, it's, if people understood how Indigenous people have worked so hard to come to where they are now, then maybe it would be a little bit easier to be employed. I don't know.
Thank you, Diane.
I also want to add to that too, that I think when there's career fairs or school orientations, I think there has to be more of an Indigenous perspective. We need to be visible more so that people know who we are and where we're coming from.
Really important point. I'm gonna just let Elaine share something. She's got her hands up.
When I lost my father, I worked at University of Fraser Valley, and they understood my position as the oldest daughter, and I was given a lot of leeway because my dad was chief, well-respected man. I was given funeral leave. I was given compassionate leave, and I was the executor of his estate, and I had to take more than 2 weeks off, and they just kept piling on the days that I could have, and so it was compassionate leave, funeral leave, and I can't remember what else, vacation and sick leave. They added that all up just so I could attend to my father's end of life, what we had to do for him. But that is very fortunate. I don't think I could have gotten away with that anywhere else. And so it is really hard being, a native in a non-native organization, because we're so family oriented that is really, really hard for them to understand, like how it affects, when we lose somebody, it affects the whole community. And then it's just, um, some don't understand. And when I worked at UFE, I had to support, well, I was at Seabird College too, so I had to support many students with losses or with everything that they face in rural life. And and they don't understand how close we are, because when one of the students, I had to help her because her grandmother passed away. And then a week or two later, her husband's grandmother passed away. So then that meant two losses within such a short period of time. And I had to talk to the instructors and explain. And so it is very hard to get back on your feet after all these losses. And it's so hard for non-native organizations to understand that. Thank you.
I just wanted to pick up on what Elaine said. The word that she used actually broke my heart when she said, I don't think I would have got away with it somewhere else. And that notion of, following through on family commitments and on historical traditional protocols, like in my own family, losing my dad or losing my husband or losing my daughter, there was so much grace around me. And so I just really wanted to highlight the language that Elaine just used, that even in with an employer that, it sounds like she felt very blessed to be working there, and there were benefits. And as Mindy mentioned in the chat, lots of employers don't have benefits. So if people are taking time off, then they need to be doing it without pay. I think that it's really important for those of us witnessing this conversation today to feel that language and feel that when we are suffering an incredible loss and taking on responsibilities and traditional responsibilities that every family has, sort of traditions and expectations of different family members, and that layered onto that, there's that sense of if somebody is treating me well, I'm getting away with something. I just really hope that we can move past that language. And Elaine, I just really wanted to thank you for sharing that experience.
I think this really closely relates to the next topic that I want to take us into. Like, we've really focused in on understanding the community and the connection and the importance and how necessary that understanding is. And I often remember, and I don't know who the speaker was, but he said, there is no reconciliation without truth. And so that truth piece is so incredibly important. And so many of the comments we've had here today already and the thoughts that people have shared have really centered around this truth and understanding. And then it's this respect piece that I want to move us forward in. So maybe, Peter, you can get us started with that discussion. And I'll just quickly share my screen so people can see that there's a Menti still for you to contribute to if you've got some questions, thoughts there.
Yeah, I think that really in our work, it didn't matter who we spoke to, be they an employer, an employee, a job seeker, even a service provider. I think that the consistent theme was a value of seeking to be respected, but also to give respect. And I think that where we start to experience these kinds of challenges is in terms of how people don't feel respected. And I'm wondering how you might recognize where respect is evident. I don't know if we want to throw this question to our guests. Yes?
Yes,
So,
maybe. Diana, do you think maybe you could start for us?
how do you see being respected?
Being respected, honestly, for me, it's, I've always known to respect people no matter how they treat you or what they say and do to you. But as I've gotten older, for myself, it's you got to give respect to get respect. And in order to do that, you have to show people some empathy, show them some sympathy, when it comes to certain situations in their life. Giving a hello with a smile and, to somebody on the street, that's showing somebody respect. That's showing somebody that, a smile a day, keeps the doctors away kind of thing. So for myself, respect is just acknowledging the person, acknowledging what they're doing, what they're going through kind of thing, not trying to pry into their lives, but, being in a workplace, respecting somebody in, how they're doing things, making sure that they're not alone, understanding and letting them know that they're not alone. I've been in a lot of positions of feeling alone, and not having that connection where you can actually talk to somebody who knows more about your culture. And there's many, many, many different cultures out there. So understanding all the cultures and just being there for somebody. That's all I kind of got. Sorry.
Thank you. No, that's fantastic. Corinne, can I turn to you and say, what would you say is the impact on a job seeker or employee at some point when there is or is not respect shown in the workplace?
Well, I've been there. Matter of fact, it just happened again this morning. To me, just feeling disrespected by my colleagues that I work around with, and it gives you the feeling of just you don't want to be here, you don't want to be around. So when an employee, First Nations person, is not respected within their work environment, they don't want to stay. And they sometimes don't know how to communicate that and to put out how they feel. So again, it's just turn, walk out the door, and leave, and not come back. So it's having to teach how to be, working with the client on looking at their values, what's important to them, how are they feeling respected, how do they respect others, looking at a work environment, is that the kind of place you feel you would be respected, does it coincide with your values and such. I think it's very it's difficult. I grew up to respect my elders, to respect people around, and like Diane said, it's about just respecting others and then gaining that respect from them. But I mean, I've been disrespected by my own community as well as non-Indigenous, and so it can go both ways. And I think it's how it perceives, for me, it's how do I perceive my emotion and how am I going to handle that situation at that time. And again, I think it's about being able to voice your concern and be able to stand up for what you value and what you believe in, and not be scared to tell people this is what you value. Again, it's all around the communication, but I know employers have, like Diane said, we come along, they think we're all alcoholics or lazy, or because there's Indian time. What does that mean? So we come into a work environment with all of this baggage already, and it's hard to try to how do you work with that? And I guess that's the question. Again, it's about communicating and understanding your values, understanding what it is you need and want in a work environment, and targeting those areas. Not want to work somewhere just because the money's good, but is it a place that you'll be valued at?
Wonderful. Great suggestions for any field worker, caseworker, people who are trying to guide clients into new employment situations. So, yeah, thank you so much for that. That's so helpful.